6 months after the class of 1941's graduation, America was at war. A new reality would confront the freshly minted Regis graduates. At the time of their June graduation, the draft only required those between 21 and 35 years of age to register with local draft boards. It meant that the 1941 boys would not be called upon for at least another 3 years. However, with the declaration of war against Japan and Germany, a series of congressional amendments would lower the age limit to 18 years. By the end of 1942, all the boys of the 1941 class would be required to register for military service. This also included those who entered seminaries to take up religious vocations. It was only later in 1943 when laws would be enacted to exempt ministers and those studying divinity from active duty. For most of the Regis boys who had lived their entire lives in the New York metropolitan area, military conscription would take them to distant parts of America for training. George Better, the academically accomplished member of the stage crew, would be shipped to Camp McCain, Mississippi. He would correspond with Father Gabriel Zema at Regis and joked that despite all the classical education he received at school, the military saw it fit to make him an engineer.
He registered in 1942. I think he was actually inducted in 1943, spent about a year in Oklahoma and Texas. First he went for a semester to University of Oklahoma to study engineering. But then they needed bodies in Europe and European theater, so then he was sent to Texas. He was good in math, and so I guess that's part of the reason why they wanted him to do this. They trained him for artillery and to be a forward observer.
I got a scholarship there. I attended Regis High School in New York City and went for 2 years to Staten Island. And then I qualified for a half scholarship to Manhattan College, Staten Island Division, which was the answer to my parents getting me and permitting me to start college. So anyway, I qualified. Well, went in the Navy in the spring of '43. Right from engineer. I was just completing second year of engineering school, and I went in the service then. But I did have my basic physics and mathematics accomplished at that time. I qualified from that basis, and then when I went into the Navy with that basis of 2 years of engineering school at Manhattan College, I took the test and was put in right from boot camp into the electronic program. So that's how I began Navy electronics.
The sudden shift from student life to taking up arms against battle-hardened enemies was surely met with some trepidation, though there were no signs the 1941 boys hesitated from the call of duty. In fact, at least a couple would cheat their way into service. David Manning had initially been deferred by the draft board, but he persisted and eventually succeeded in enlisting through some astute trickery.
Dad had poor eyesight and memorized the eye chart in order to go into the Army. And in 1943, I think it was, that he went in. They found out he was blind in one eye, so they couldn't send him over. He went in the Army. They couldn't send him over in the infantry, so they put him with the equipment, the heavy equipment, to learn engineering. He was trained as an engineer.
Charles Cade would use the same strategy in order to fulfill his ambition of becoming a military pilot.
He wanted to go be a fighter pilot. That was his dream. He had a problem with his eyesight. He had, I wouldn't say a photographic memory, but a crazy good memory. But however they conducted the test, he memorized the board because I think maybe people in front of you were going while you were there or whatever. So he tricked them and passed it. They did the training and became a pilot. So he did get accepted to the training for flying in Florida. By the time he was ready to go to Europe to fight, there was no fighting happening. It was like right as the war was winding up.
While he never saw active combat in Europe, Charles would remain in the Air Force and would later serve in the Korean War before becoming a commercial pilot with TWA later in life. Not everyone waited to be drafted, though. Many felt the profound urge to serve once America was attacked. As the oldest boy in the class of 1941, Jill Wager was already 19 years old when he received his Regis diploma. He was thus scheduled to be the first amongst his Regis classmates to register for the draft. Jill had joked that 4 years at Regis would leave no one in any shape to pass a physical exam. In reality, though, rather than waiting to be called to serve, Jill would enlist directly in the Army. By March of 1942, he would be training with the Army Signals Corps at Camp Upton in Long Island.
I went in 43. I was going to school in New York. I had about 2.5 years of college completed by that particular time. And they said, "We want you." I think they were wrong, but that's okay. I volunteered. I got caught in the mess all on my own. I took my basic training down the infantry school in Fort Benning. The reason for this was a bunch of us were picked and we were supposed to take part in a program they called ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program, also known very euphemistically as All Safe to Peace. It didn't turn out that way, where there were a large number of casualties in Europe that they had not really projected that high. And they were very, very short of people to serve there. So they started cleaning out essentially all the camps they had in the United States.
Just a week after Pearl Harbor, Jerry Donahue would enlist in the Marine Corps shortly after he turned 18. The Second World War's conscription didn't just involve recent graduates, and several teachers were also drawn into service. One of the first to see action was Father Dan Burke, the prefect of studies when the class of 1941 was at Regis. Commander Burke would serve as the chaplain aboard the legendary USS Philadelphia. The battlecruiser was the flagship of the greatest US war fleet at the time, when it spearheaded Allied invasions of North Africa in November of 1942. Operation Torch would be America's earliest cross-Atlantic military action in the European North African theater, a year and a half before D-Day. Once Axis forces were defeated in Africa, Father Burke and the crew of the Philadelphia would be involved in 4 other major naval operations in the war. The Philadelphia would help the Allies control the Mediterranean and land American troops in Italy and southern France. The cruiser would earn the nickname the Galloping Ghost for its tenacity and ability to evade enemy attacks.
We began to be places where no one expected us. Began to sight on targets that you just can't hit with a cruiser, but we hit them. We got around Sicily. Got around so fast that the Germans gave us the name the Galloping Ghost of the Sicilian Coast.
But in 1942, drafted members of the 41 class were still mostly undergoing training back stateside. Frank Marchini and Dominic Salamone were both assigned to artillery units. Frank was a student at Holy Cross College when his studies were disrupted to enter the Army. Before his call-up, Frank also worked in his family business in New York, which provided an important supply to the US Navy. The Marchini Ice Cream Corporation regularly received orders to provide its famous treats to ships departing from the Brooklyn Naval Yard. Given their age, sequence of the draft, and training requirements, many of the class of 1941 would be called to action around or after the D-Day landing in the summer of 1944.
After he graduated from Regis, World War II broke out, and he went to Fordham University and then left for the war and was gone about 3 years. While in the Army, he was assigned to an anti-aircraft unit. As a result of that, he had some difficulty with hearing and put like a ringing in his ear from the guns. He was part of D-Day, but if I understand it correctly, they were numbered, and his D-Day number was when things were safer and more under control. He never talked much about his experiences, which is understandable. One story he did tell me was when the Army unit that he was with was staying in an abandoned home in France. Some of the soldiers went up in the attic and found Christmas decorations and brought them down. He then didn't really want to continue with the story because I think it brought up some terrible memories.
The general timing of the class of 1941's entry into active service would coincide with the fiercest 12 months of fighting in Europe. Joining Jill Wager in the Signals Corps were James Dunn and Andrew Cangelosi, all of whom would be involved in the year-long Allied push eastward towards Berlin. The redesigned Army Signals Corps would prioritize soldiers who were adept in more technical, scientific, and math-based backgrounds. George Cogswell would initially enlist in the U.S. Cavalry, but amidst divisional reorganization, the Army would find George's talents in the sciences better suited in the medical corps by the time he arrived in Europe. Russell Casey would undergo parachute training and would spend much of his active duties in France, including at the Allied Forces Command Headquarters. Like his Regis basketball teammate Charles Cade, Tom Kelly would enlist in the Army Air Corps. Tom would rise up in rank to become the co-pilot and second in command of the 833rd B-17 Bomber Squadron. They would be based in Sudbury, England, from which Tom and his crew would engage in 29 combat missions over the European continent. By the end of the war, Tom's 833rd would earn 5 battle stars and an Oak Leaf Cluster Air Medal. Alphonse Théon, who only a few years earlier had been playing baseball for Regis and working at a bowling alley after school, would have one of the most harrowing wartime roles as a forward artillery observer. He had to constantly work behind enemy lines and would credit a very special partner for keeping him alive during the war.
His teammate or companion was a man named Charlie, and he was either Navajo or Apache. And he came from the Southwest, and he was used to being outside. My dad was a city boy, or relatively, and was much more urban in orientation. His buddy Charlie saved his life more than once because he knew how to walk in the woods and could sense things because he had done that all his life. On one occasion, they were walking along a path or someplace in Alsace or somewhere in Germany, and his buddy would knock him over, and then a sniper would have shot him. He saved him from a sniper once because he sensed where this person was. He told me the Ardennes forest was pretty horrific. Another time they were in a farmhouse, and they had a new recruit that had just joined them who started cooking breakfast in the farmhouse, which meant that smoke came out of the chimney of the farmhouse. Charlie ran down to stop it. Just then, a shell came and hit the farmhouse, but he and his friend were okay, but the young man, I think, got killed.
As American troops penetrated further east, they were met by fierce resistance from Nazi forces. With the onset of a brutal winter in 1944, conditions became increasingly bitter when the Battle of the Bulge began. Andrew Cassidy, the quiet kid from the tenements near Regis, was part of the Army infantry that would face the last major German offensive campaign in the Ardennes region. He had been a student at Yale just before entering the military in 1942. After the Winter Battle of the Bulge, Andrew would continue fighting the Rhine campaign right into the German heartland towards Berlin. Further south, American forces had also successfully landed in southern France after heavy coastal bombardment by Allied ships, including Father Burke's USS Philadelphia. Over the next few months, American troops would fight their way towards Munich, Germany's major southern city. By then, George Beder had distinguished himself as a staff sergeant, the highest rank for non-commissioned officers, and he would write about the harsh winter conditions amidst stretched supply lines. Fighting was especially fierce as American troops were now deep into German territory. And at the town of Killer in the Baden-Württemberg region, only 150 miles from Munich, the class of 1941 would lose one of their own. George Beder was killed in action. At Regis, he was the boy known to always help anyone when asked. George was 20 years old and an only child. Back north, as winter gave way to warmer weather in the spring of 1945, and American troops had withstood German counteroffensives, Allied forces would continue their eastward assault. But in order to reach Berlin, they had to first breach the Rhine. While Hitler's Reich was on the verge of collapse, German defenses along the Rhine River held strong. One of the few remaining crossing points was the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, and it would be the site of one of the great military actions of the Second World War. Donald Donahue, one of the St. Joan of Arc boys at Regis, was an anti-tank specialist with the 309th Infantry Regiment of the 78th Division.
He told me that he was supposed to be in the Air Force, and then they plucked them up and basically brought them over to Germany and plucked them down.
He would recall tremendous casualties of 10% of his regiment per week at the Battle of the Bulge, and how at least a quarter of his brothers in arms suffered from frostbite that winter. Donald would be part of the vanguard force that captured the Ludendorff Bridge, which was surprisingly left relatively unscathed by retreating German defenders. He would cross the bridge at 2 a.m. in the morning to quickly set up anti-tank positions to defend the bridge against inevitable German counterattacks, and to allow the bulk of Allied forces to breach the Rhine. Donald's service in Europe was later cut short when a German army truck would rush and crash into the jeep he was in. His head went through the glass and required 100 stitches. He would fortunately survive, but would carry visible scars on him for the rest of his life.
He did have quite a scar, and that was his duty, and he, fought.
Lieutenant John Beccari was part of the 69th Infantry Division that would cross the Ludendorff Bridge that Donald helped secure. The 69th would continue to push further east and would famously link up with the Soviet army at Torgau. As a senior at Regis, John Beccari had expressed strong apprehension about America being pulled into a European conflict by Britain. Yet when Germany declared war against the United States, he didn't hesitate to fight. John would enter the University of Pennsylvania after the war as a decorated hero, winning the Bronze Star for Valor and a Purple Heart for wounds sustained for his country while in Germany. Similarly, Justin Walker, who had been named the wittiest and best comedian of the 1941 class, would also be awarded the Bronze Star with the Oak Leaf Cluster for heroism on different occasions, as well as the State Conspicuous Medal for exceptionally meritorious service. Justin was a member of New York's famous 42nd Rainbow Infantry Division that fought in France and Germany. In the final weeks of Hitler's reign, Justin participated in the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp and helped reveal the horrific extent of Nazi atrocities. Amongst the 1941 boys, not everyone who served in the Atlantic side of World War II was involved in the European continent. The short-statured but tenacious Lieutenant Bill Toot would receive his officer commission in the Army Air Corps.
He was like 5'4", 120 pounds. That was on his identification card for the Army.
He would serve in air control and as a weatherman in North Africa, primarily Egypt.
So he was able to get into this program of meteorological study. It was at NYU. From there, he went to North Africa and Egypt and Cairo. Spent a lot of time making maps of North Africa in an Air Force portion of the Army, what is now the Air Force.
David Manning, who finally snuck his way into the Army Engineering Corps, would not leave the US mainland. As the war drew out and important prisoners of war were brought back to the US, David would be involved in escorting POWs.
Dad escorted prisoners up and down the West Coast, California to Washington.
Separately, while Jerry Donahue had enlisted in the Marines when he turned 18, he would switch his commission over to the Navy. Lieutenant Donahue's first active duty would be on the destroyer USS Thomas, which was charged with hunting U-boats in the Atlantic. During his time abroad, the Thomas would be involved in the sinking of 2 German submarines. Jerry would recall the thrill of the destroyer charging with all guns blazing at U-boat 233 after the submarine had been forced to the surface with depth charges. The Thomas would ram and slice the hull of the U-boat, which sank in less than a minute. Jerry's Regis commuting buddy and fellow St. Joan of Arc alumni from Jackson Heights, Bill Carroll, also received his assignment in the Navy. He was part of a radar team on the USS Prince Williams.
It's the USS Prince William, named after Prince William Sound, Alaska. And that's how it got its name. So they named all of these ships after sounds and bays of North America.
Given Bill's fascination with aircrafts, which had also led him to join the Regis Model Club, he must have been in heaven, as the Prince Williams was also responsible for ferrying new fighter planes to free French forces in Casablanca.
One day before we arrived in Casablanca Harbor, the Prince William passed word, any crew members who can speak French. So another radar man and I had French in high school. So I said to him, boy from Seattle, Washington, too, on there, I said, we'd better go down to the quarterdeck and tell him we had French in high school. He said, Bill, he said, how many, there were 50 guys down there. They claimed they had French in high school. So, come on, we got to get down there tomorrow morning. They want us done. 4 sailors on the aircraft carrier showed up and said, yes, we had French in school. So they took our names and said, all right, now stand by in a few hours. We're going to get the first French officers come on board, and they want to meet any French-speaking American sailors. So a French military of some kind come on board, and they spoke English. And they came up to the quarterdeck and they passed word for Carroll and three others of us who claimed we've had French. Now, out of about 800 guys on that ship, 3 of us said we could speak French. So we got down there, and these 2 French officers came on who spoke English fairly well on there. So came down, we introduced ourselves on there. So I said, Je m'appelle Guillaume Carroll. And the Frenchman looked at me and said, French? I said, no, je suis Irlandais. I'm Irish. He cracked up. So he turned me on in French, I still had my high school. I was pretty good at it, He said, gee, you're going to be some help to us,
Jerry and Bill would not complete their service in the Atlantic side of the war. When Germany surrendered in May of 1945, America's bloody fight in the Pacific was still ongoing. the 2 Regis alumni would be quickly reassigned to the war effort on that side of the world.